The letter arrived on a Tuesday, smelling faintly of lavender and bearing the careful penmanship of a woman who had clearly spent considerable time composing her thoughts. And when John Trask unfolded it at his kitchen table with flour-dusted fingers and read the words, "I can cook anything you set before me, and I am not afraid of hard work," he felt something shift in his chest that he had not felt in a very long time. It was the spring of 1878, and John Trask was 32 years old, a rancher outside the town of Caldwell, Kansas, which sat just north of the Indian Territory border and hummed with the restless energy of cattle drives, trail dust, and men who lived hard and died harder. His ranch, the Double T, spread across 400 acres of rolling grassland, and he ran 300 head of longhorn cattle with the help of two hands, a man named Pete Calloway and a younger fellow named Darnell Webb. The land was good. The cattle were healthy. The water from the creek that cut through his east pasture ran clear even in dry summer months. But the house, Lord, the house was a sorry thing. It had been built by the previous owner, a trapper named Whitfield who had lived alone for 20 years and cared nothing for comfort. 3 rooms, a stone fireplace that smoked when the wind came from the northwest, a kitchen with a cast-iron stove that worked if you coaxed it right, and a single window in the bedroom that looked out over the cattle pen and smelled of it on warm days. John had bought the property 4 years ago when he came up from Texas after his mother passed and left him a small inheritance, enough to get started. He had been surviving in that house ever since. Surviving was the correct word. He ate beans from a pot that he kept on the stove and refilled as needed. He ate salt pork until he could not look at it without his jaw tightening. He ate bread that was more like a flat, hard disk of disappointment, the result of his complete misunderstanding of how leavening worked. Pete Calloway, who had a wife and 2 children in town and came to the ranch every morning at sunup, would sometimes look at whatever John was eating and shake his head with the slow mournfulness of a man witnessing something that could not be helped. "You ought to find yourself a wife, Mr. Trask," Pete had said one morning in February, watching John eat cold beans directly from the pot with a spoon, standing at the kitchen window in his long underwear. "A man needs someone to look after him." "I look after myself just fine," John had said. Pete had said nothing. He did not need to say anything. The idea had taken root anyway, the way ideas do when you plant them in soil that is already prepared for them. John had been thinking about it for 2 years if he was honest with himself. He was not a lonely man by nature, but loneliness has a way of arriving regardless of your nature, settling in the corners of a house like dust that accumulates despite how often you sweep. He had been married once briefly, to a woman named Clara who had come to Kansas with bright eyes and good intentions, and lasted 14 months before the isolation and the wind and the endless flat horizon had broken something in her that could not be repaired. She had gone back to Ohio in the fall of 1875, and he had not heard from her since, and the divorce had been finalized through letters and a lawyer in Wichita. He did not blame Clara. He had never blamed Clara, but he was not going to make that mistake again, bringing a woman who was not suited for the life out here. This time he would be practical. He would place an advertisement in the matrimonial papers, be honest about what he had and what he needed, and find a woman who was built for this kind of life. A woman who could cook. A woman who would not look at the horizon and feel it closing in on her. He had written his advertisement carefully, sitting at that same kitchen table on a cold February night with the stove ticking and a candle throwing orange light across the paper. Rancher 32, outside Caldwell, Kansas. Good land, steady income, 300 head of cattle. Looking for a sensible woman not younger than 24, who can cook and is willing to work alongside a man building something worth having. Write to John Trask, care of the Caldwell Post Office. He had received 11 responses. He had read them all. 8 of them were immediately unsuitable for reasons that ranged from the woman being 17 years old to one who seemed primarily interested in whether he owned a piano. He did not own a piano. Two others were polite but clearly written out of desperation rather than genuine interest, and he felt sorry enough for those women to write back kindly declining. And then there was Matilda Hayes. Her letter was different from the very first line. She did not flatter him or write about herself as though she were a product on a shelf. She wrote plainly and with a kind of wry self-awareness that made him read it twice and then a third time. "Dear Mr. Trask," she had written, "I am 27 years old and have been keeping house for my father and 3 brothers in Springfield, Missouri since I was 15, which means I have been cooking for ungrateful men for 12 years and am either very good at it or very stubborn, likely both. I can cook anything you set before me, and I am not afraid of hard work. I am not a delicate woman and I do not expect life to be easy. What I do expect is to be treated with honesty and respect, and I will give the same in return. I am enclosing a recipe for my cornbread in case you would like to judge my qualifications directly." The cornbread recipe was written on a separate piece of paper, and it was detailed and precise, and included a note in the margin that read, "Do not rush the buttermilk, it matters." John Trask had written back that same night. They had exchanged 4 letters over the following 2 months. Each one taught him something new about her. She was direct. She was funny, though she seemed not entirely aware of how funny she was. She had opinions about things and she stated them clearly. She had never been married and said simply that the men in Springfield had either wanted someone prettier or someone quieter, and she was neither. She had a way of writing about ordinary things, the smell of bread baking, the particular satisfaction of a garden coming in right, that made those ordinary things feel important. By the 4th letter he had asked her to come. By her reply he knew she would. She arrived on the 3rd of May, 1878, on the afternoon stage from Wichita. John had spent the 3 days before her arrival doing things he had not done in 4 years. He swept the floors. He scrubbed the kitchen table until the grain of the wood showed through. He bought curtains from the general store in Caldwell, white cotton ones with a small blue stripe, and hung them in the bedroom window because it seemed like the kind of thing a woman might notice. He fixed the hinge on the front door that had been sagging for a year. He bought coffee and real sugar and a sack of good flour and a tin of baking powder, and he arranged them on the kitchen shelf with a care that he would have found embarrassing if anyone had seen him doing it. Pete Calloway saw him doing it. "Looking good, Mr. Trask," Pete said, leaning in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands and a broad, knowing smile on his weathered face. "That curtain's hung a little crooked, though." "It is not," John said. "Left side's about 2 inches lower than the right." John looked at the curtain for a long moment. "Go see to the horses, Pete." Pete went, still smiling. Darnell Webb, who was 20 years old and had the enthusiasm of a puppy and the tact of a fence post, had been full of advice since learning that a woman was coming to the Double T. "You should get flowers," Darnell had said. "Women like flowers. My mother always liked flowers." John had pointed out that it was early May and there were wildflowers growing along the creek, and Darnell had ridden out that morning and come back with a fistful of purple clover and yellow tickseed that was currently sitting in a tin cup on the kitchen table, and despite himself, John thought it looked all right. He drove the wagon into Caldwell at 2 in the afternoon to meet the stage, which was due at 2:30. It arrived at 3:15. He stood at the edge of the stage stop, turning his hat in his hands, feeling like a fool and knowing he looked like one. The stage door opened and 3 people got out. A heavy-set man in a traveling suit who moved like someone with a bad back. An older woman in black who was clearly in mourning and stared at the ground as she walked. And then Matilda Hayes. She was not what he had pictured. He was not sure what he had pictured exactly, but it was not this. She was of medium height, sturdy and straight-backed, with dark brown hair pinned up under a wide-brimmed straw hat that had seen better days but was clean and sat on her head at an angle that suggested she had put it there with purpose rather than vanity. She had brown eyes that took in everything around her immediately and efficiently, the way a carpenter looks at a room and starts calculating before they even take their coat off. Her face was not beautiful in the way that stopped you cold, but it was interesting, with strong cheekbones and a mouth that curved easily. And when her eyes found John standing at the edge of the crowd and she walked toward him with her carpet bag in her hand, she looked at him the way he imagined she looked at everything, directly and without pretense. "Mr. Trask," she said, stopping in front of him and holding out her hand. He shook it. Her grip was firm. "Miss Hayes, did you have a good journey?" "I had a long journey," she said, "which is not quite the same thing. Is there somewhere I can get something to eat? I have been on that stage since dawn, and the only thing I have consumed is a biscuit that could have been used as a weapon." He laughed before he could stop himself. "There is a restaurant down the street." "Good," she said, and picked up her bag again, and he noticed she had not waited for him to carry it. So he reached out anyway, and she looked at him for a moment and then handed it over, and he thought that was a reasonable compromise. They had supper at the Caldwell Hotel dining room, which served a tolerable beef stew and good coffee, and over that supper they talked more naturally than he had expected, the way people do when they have already had a real conversation in letters, and are only now putting voices to thoughts they have already shared. She asked him about the ranch, and listened carefully to his answers, asking follow-up questions that showed she had been thinking about the practicalities. She asked about the water, the garden situation, whether the kitchen stove drew well. "It draws if you're patient with it," he said. "I have been patient with stoves my whole life," she said. "My father had one that required a 15-minute conversation before it would heat properly. I never knew stoves required conversation." "Everything that needs to work properly requires some form of conversation," she said, and looked at him steadily, and he understood she was not only talking about stoves. After supper, he drove her out to the ranch as the sun was going down, and the Kansas sky turned the color of a peach left in the sun, all orange and rose and impossible. She sat beside him on the wagon seat and looked at the landscape around her, the wide grassland, the long sight lines, the few trees following the creek bed in the distance, and she was quiet for a long time. He waited, bracing himself for the look he had seen on Clara's face the first time she had seen this country, that shrinking look. "It is very big," Matilda said finally. "Yes," he agreed. "I like it," she said. "I have always been uncomfortable in places where you cannot see what is coming." Something in him unclenched. When they arrived at the ranch, the last of the daylight was turning purple and the cattle were settled and Pete and Darnell had gone home. He showed her the house, walking through each room with the slightly self-conscious awareness of someone showing something they care about, but are not sure is worth caring about. She moved through it practically, opening the firebox of the stove, checking the drawer, examining the kitchen shelves, looking out the window over the sink at the yard below. She found the tin cup of wildflowers on the kitchen table and stopped. She touched one of the yellow tickseed petals lightly with her fingertip. She did not say anything for a moment. "Those were, Darnell's idea," John said because he felt the need to say something. "Who is Darnell?" "One of my hands. He is 20 years old and thought you would like flowers." She looked at the flowers and then at John. "He was right," she said simply. He showed her the bedroom and told her it was hers, that he would take the extra blankets and sleep in the other room on the cot, and that they would work out the arrangements in due time. She accepted this without either the relief or the disappointment that might have indicated something about her expectations. She was practical about everything, and he found himself grateful for that practicality in a way he had not expected. That night, while he lay on the cot in the other room listening to the familiar sounds of the house, the wind against the eaves, the distant low of a cow, the tick of the cooling stove, he also heard a sound he had not heard in this house in 4 years. The sound of another person moving around, settling in, becoming part of the place. A drawer opening and closing, the soft sound of footsteps crossing the bedroom floor. Then quiet. He lay looking at the ceiling for a long time before he slept, and when he did sleep, it was the deepest sleep he had had in months. The next morning he woke to a smell that stopped him cold before he was even fully conscious. It was bread. Real bread, yeast bread, the kind with a crust that caught the heat and turned golden and smelled like something that meant a place was lived in and cared for. He sat up on the cot and stared at the wall between him and the kitchen for a full 5 seconds before he got up, pulled on his trousers and shirt, and went to the kitchen doorway. Matilda Hayes was standing at his stove in a clean apron, and she had been at work for some time. There was a loaf of bread cooling on the table, beside another tin of something that smelled like it had onions and smoked meat in it, and she was cracking eggs into a cast-iron skillet with the efficient movements of someone who does not waste a single motion in a kitchen. The stove was glowing and drawing perfectly, and the morning light was coming through the curtain on the window and laying a stripe of gold across the floor. She heard him and turned. "There is coffee," she said, nodding toward the pot on the back of the stove. "Sit down. Eggs will be ready in a minute." He sat down. He poured himself a cup of coffee, which was strong and perfectly made. He watched her cook in silence, aware that he was witnessing something he had not seen in this kitchen before, competence and care moving together without any wasted effort, like watching a good rider with a good horse, everything working the way it was meant to. She set a plate in front of him. 2 eggs cooked just past runny, a thick slice of the bread with butter she had apparently found somewhere, though he was not sure where he had put the butter. He had bought it yesterday. A small bowl of the onion and smoked meat thing, which turned out to be a hash that had no right to taste as good as it did from the ingredients he had left in that kitchen. He took a bite of the bread. He stopped chewing. He looked at the bread in his hand. He looked at Matilda, who was sitting across the table with her own plate and her coffee, and watching him with the measured expression of someone waiting for a verdict she already knows but is being polite about. "This is," he started. "Yes," she said. "This is the best bread I have had since my mother died." Something in her expression shifted, softened slightly. "That is a real compliment," she said. "Thank you." They ate breakfast, and he told her about the day's work ahead, and she asked about the garden space behind the house, which was currently nothing but weedy ground, and about whether there was a root cellar, which there was, though it was not well stocked. She asked about the nearest town and what was available at the general store. She was already planning. He could see it in her eyes, the way she was filing information away and organizing it into some structure in her head. When Pete Calloway arrived at sunup, he stopped in the kitchen doorway and stared at the remains of breakfast on the table, the bread, the skillet, the coffee pot, and then at Matilda, who was already washing up at the basin. "Ma'am," he said, pulling off his hat. "You must be Pete," she said without turning around. "Mr. Trask told me about you. There is coffee on the stove and bread on the table. Help yourself." Pete looked at John with an expression that said many things at once. John gave a small nod toward the coffee, and Pete poured himself a cup and tore off a piece of bread and ate it standing there in the doorway, and his eyes closed very briefly in the way of a man experiencing something he had been missing without knowing it. Darnell arrived 20 minutes later, skidded to a stop in the yard when he saw laundry hanging on a line that had not existed yesterday, which Matilda had apparently strung between 2 posts before John was even awake, walked into the kitchen, and said, "Good morning, ma'am," in a voice that cracked on the last word, and Matilda handed him a plate without being asked and told him to sit down. "You are very efficient," John said to her when Pete and Darnell had gone out to start the day's work. "I was managing a household at 15, she said, wringing out a cloth over the basin. "Efficiency is the only way any of it gets done." She paused and turned to look at him with that direct, measuring gaze. "Your root cellar is nearly empty. I need to know what the budget is for supplies, and I need a day in town sometime this week to get what I need." "I will take you Thursday," he said. "Good." She turned back to the basin. "And that stove wants a new gasket on the firebox door. The heat is leaking. That is why your bread never cooked properly." He stood very still for a moment. "How do you know my bread never cooked properly?" She glanced over her shoulder at him. "Because there is a pan on that shelf with burn marks on the bottom that tell a very clear story, Mr. Trask." He looked at the pan. He looked at her. He picked up his hat from the hook by the door and went out to see to his cattle, and as he crossed the yard, he was aware of something he could not quite name yet, something that felt like the way the land looked after a long drought finally broke, and the green came back into the grass. He was not sure what to do with it yet, so he just walked out into the morning and got on with the work. The weeks that followed changed the double T in ways that John had not anticipated and could not entirely explain. It was not simply that there was better food, though there was dramatically better food. Matilda's cooking was not elaborate or fancy. It was honest, substantial food made from whatever was available, but she had a talent for it that turned ordinary ingredients into something that made a man feel genuinely fed rather than merely not hungry. She made soups that used the bones from whatever meat they had, long-simmered things that filled the house with warmth and smell. She made beans that bore no resemblance to the gray, listless beans John had been eating for 4 years, rich and savory with whatever she had put in them, bacon or herbs, or sometimes a small dried pepper from a string she had bought in town and hung from a nail in the kitchen. She made pies on Sundays, whatever fruit was available, and the first time John ate a piece of her apple pie, sitting at the kitchen table on a warm May evening, he set down his fork and looked at the ceiling for a moment in the manner of a man recalibrating something. "What is the matter?" Matilda asked. "Nothing," he said. "I am just realizing something." "What?" He looked at her. "How little I have been living." She was quiet for a moment. There was something in her face that moved, some warmth crossing through it. "Well," she said, "you are living now." But it was more than the cooking. The house itself was changing. Not dramatically, she was not a woman who needed things to be ornate, but she had a sense of what made a space comfortable rather than merely functional, and she applied it with the same quiet efficiency she applied to everything. She made a rag rug for the kitchen from strips of old clothing John had been about to throw away, and it covered the cold stone floor by the stove and made that corner of the room feel warmer even when the temperature did not change. She found 2 wooden chairs in the barn that had been stored and forgotten and cleaned them up and put them on the front porch, and in the evenings before the sun went down, they would sometimes sit out there and watch the sky change color over the grassland, and it turned out to be one of the pleasures John had not known he had access to. She started a kitchen garden in the plot behind the house, turning the ground with a spade herself and planting seeds she had brought from Missouri in a small paper envelope tucked into her carpet bag. Beans, squash, tomatoes, an herb patch of thyme and sage, and a few other things. She recruited Darnell to help her build a low fence around it to keep out the rabbits, and Darnell, who would have done anything Matilda Hayes asked him to because she fed him and talked to him like a human being, had it done in 2 days and came back every morning after that to check on its progress with the devotion of a man who had invested in something. "Your hands eat at your table now," Pete told John one afternoon, when they were mending fence out in the east pasture. It was not a complaint. "Pete said it the way you say something that is a fact and also a good one." "I know," John said. "My Ellie says you're a lucky man," Pete said. "She says not everyone gets a woman like that." John drove a staple into the post he was working on and said nothing, because what he wanted to say was something like, "I know that too, and I think about it more than I should." And that was not something he was prepared to say to Pete Calloway on a Tuesday afternoon in a fence line. But he was thinking about it. He was thinking about it in the mornings when she was already up before him and the smell of coffee came through the door. He was thinking about it in the evenings on the porch. He was thinking about it when they were in the kitchen together after supper and she would read. She had a small collection of books she had brought, and he would be doing the accounts at the table, and the lamplight was warm and the house was quiet, and it felt like something he had not let himself want. The problem was that they had come to this arrangement practically. She had come as a prospective wife, yes, but neither of them had made any promises beyond trying. They had not discussed any formal arrangement since her arrival. The days had simply moved forward, each one adding to the next, and somewhere in those days they had settled into a pattern that felt, to John at least, dangerously close to the thing he actually wanted rather than the practical arrangement he had told himself he needed. He did not know what Matilda felt. She was warm, but she was not demonstrative. She was kind, but she was not soft. She was easy to be around and impossible to read, and he had been spending a good deal of energy trying to read her and arriving at conclusions he was not sure he could trust. It was a conversation about cattle that changed things, which was, he supposed, fitting. It was the third week of May, and he had come in from a long day of separating cattle for the trail drive that Pete's brother was running north to Dodge City, and he was tired and dirty, and in the particular kind of foul mood that comes from hours of work in the sun that does not go entirely right. He came into the kitchen and found Matilda at the table with a piece of paper in front of her and a pencil in her hand, and she looked up at him. "I want to show you something," she said. He hung up his hat and his vest and came to the table. She had drawn a diagram of the garden plot, and around it a series of calculations, yields, projected harvests, what she would need to put up enough stores to get through a Kansas winter without running short. "The kitchen is under provision for winter," she said. "I have been going through what I can see and what I know about how much a household this size needs, and I think we should expand the garden by at least a third this year and invest in proper canning jars, which I did not see in the root cellar. There are some old ones in the barn," he said, sitting down heavily across from her. "Old ones with lids that seal. Some of them," she made a note. "I will look tomorrow." "I also think," she said, and then she paused, and when she looked up there was something in her expression that was more careful than her usual directness. "I think if I am going to be managing this household properly, we should probably discuss the arrangement." Properly. He looked at her. The lamplight was turning her hair warm at the edges where it had come loose from its pins after the day. He was very tired and not at his most careful. "What would you like the arrangement to be?" he asked. She set her pencil down. "I would like to know whether this is a trial or whether it is something else," she said. "I have been here 3 weeks and I am not complaining about the 3 weeks. I have been planning ahead, and it is difficult to plan ahead when I do not know what I am planning for." He looked at her for a long moment. He was aware of every sound in the house, the tick of the stove, the wind outside, the distant sound of one of the cattle in the near pen. "I would like it to be something else," he said. She held his gaze. "Then you had better tell me that plainly, Mr. Trask." "John," he said. "What?" "You have been calling me Mr. Trask for 3 weeks. My name is John." She was very still for a moment. Then something crossed her face that was not quite a smile but was close to one, warm and private. "John," she said. "Then tell me plainly." "I want you to stay," he said. "Not because you can cook, though you cook better than anyone I have ever known. Not because the house is better and the garden is growing and the men who work for me are, I think, eating properly for the first time in months. I want you to stay because I look forward to coming in at the end of the day, and I have not felt that way in years, and because you are the most interesting person I have talked to in a very long time, and because when I think about this ranch in 5 years, I can only picture it with you in it." He stopped. He was not a man who usually said that many words at once, and he could feel the back of his neck getting warm. Matilda Hayes looked at him across the kitchen table in the lamplight for a long moment. Then she said, "That was more than plainly, that was substantially. Is that a problem?" "No," she said. "It is very much not a problem." She looked down at the paper in front of her and then back up at him. "I want to stay. I wanted to stay from about the 3rd morning if I am being equally plain. But I also want to be clear that I am not someone who will be pleasant and silent. I have opinions and I will state them, and I will not always be easy to get along with, and I expect to be treated as someone whose thoughts on the matter are worth having." "I know that," he said. "I think I knew that from your first letter." "Then we understand each other," she said. "I believe we do." "Good," she said, and picked up her pencil again. "Now about those canning jars." He laughed genuinely, the kind of laugh that comes out of relief and happiness mixed together, and she looked up at him with that not-quite smile again, and something between them that had been held carefully at a distance settled into something closer. They were married in Caldwell on the 14th of June, 1878, at the small Methodist church, with Pete Calloway and his wife Ellie as witnesses and Darnell Webb standing in the back in a new shirt that was a size too small and looking very moved about the whole thing. The preacher was a man named Holloway who had a cold, but soldiered through the ceremony with dignity. Matilda wore a dress she had made herself from fabric bought at the general store, a dark blue calico that suited her, and John wore his good suit, which Matilda had noted needed letting out in the shoulders and had quietly altered the week before. When Reverend Holloway said he could kiss the bride, John looked at Matilda, and she looked at him with those steady brown eyes and an expression that was warm and clear, and he leaned in and kissed her, gently, and she kissed him back with a firmness that he thought was probably very Matilda. Ellie Calloway cried a little. Pete Calloway looked at the ceiling in the manner of a man trying not to be moved. Darnell Webb made a sound that he immediately converted into a cough. After the ceremony there was a small dinner at the hotel, and then they drove back to the Double T in the long June evening, and the sky was the color of something magnificent, all purple and coral, and the horses moved at a comfortable walk, and Matilda sat beside him on the wagon seat as she had sat beside him 6 weeks before when he had driven her out the first time, only now she was sitting a little closer, close enough that her shoulder was against his arm, and neither of them moved away. "Are you happy?" he asked her because he wanted to know. She considered it with the same seriousness she brought to everything. "Yes," she said. "Are you?" "Very," he said. "Good," she said. "Then we should not waste it." He was not entirely sure what she meant by that, but he thought it was one of the truest things he had ever heard. The summer came on in full force, the Kansas heat settling over the grassland in a great pressing weight that made the cattle slow and the creek drop a few inches and the air shimmer at midday. Matilda managed the heat the way she managed everything, practically, by shifting the heaviest cooking to the early morning and the evening, keeping the water crocks filled from the creek, and putting out wide basins of water on the porch for the hired men to cool their hands and faces when they came in. She and John were finding their rhythm, the careful and sometimes lively process of two people learning where they fit around each other. They agreed on most things and disagreed on some, and the disagreements were generally short because both of them preferred saying what they thought directly to circling around it, which meant arguments were quick and decisive, and usually led somewhere productive. There was a disagreement about the pig. John did not want a pig. He had his reasons. A pig required a proper enclosure, smelled bad in summer, and was, in his opinion, more trouble than it was worth when they were already managing cattle and a kitchen garden. Matilda wanted a pig because a pig meant lard, and lard meant better pastry and better frying, and a dozen other things that she was currently making do without. "A pig is not a small undertaking," he said. "Neither was this whole ranch, and you undertook that," she said. "That is not the same thing. The principle is the same, an investment that pays back in kind." They went back and forth about it over 3 days, which was longer than most of their discussions, and in the end Darnell Webb came back from town with the information that a family 2 miles west was selling a young sow for 50 cents, and Matilda looked at John, and John looked at Matilda, and Pete Calloway was very carefully not looking at either of them. "Fine," John said. The pig arrived. Darnell built the pen. The pig turned out to be, despite John's stated lack of enthusiasm, a good-natured animal that kept the property clear of certain kinds of scraps and was, as Matilda had predicted, an investment that paid back in kind. In November, when they slaughtered it, they had enough lard and cured pork to make a significant difference in how they went into winter, and the next Sunday's pie crust was the finest thing John had ever put in his mouth. "You are not going to say anything," Matilda said, watching him eat it. "I am going to say," he said carefully, "that you were right about the pig." She looked very satisfied. "That is what I thought." The summer also brought the matter of the neighbors to the south. A family named the Coopers who had a small farm operation and had been struggling since the father broke his leg in April, and could not work. Matilda heard about it from Ellie Calloway when she went into town in July, and she came home and told John, and there was a brief exchange of looks, and then Matilda packed up a basket with bread and salt pork and 2 jars from her carefully built-up store of preserved green beans, and John hitched the wagon and drove her over. The Cooper family was a man named Roy who was 40 and looked 60 from pain and hard years, his wife Martha who was thin and worn but had bright eyes, and 4 children ranging from 6 to 14. Martha Cooper cried a little when she saw what was in the basket. Roy Cooper was awkward about it in the way of a man not used to needing help, and John talked to him for a while about cattle and the weather and other things that let Roy Cooper feel like a man being visited by a neighbor rather than a charity case. Matilda sat with Martha and the children in the kitchen and showed the oldest girl, who was 14 and serious-faced, how to make the beans stretch into a proper soup with whatever else they had. She stayed for 2 hours. When they left, John glanced at her as they drove back and she was looking out at the grass with a distant expression. "You are thinking about something," he said. "I am thinking about how thin those children were," she said. "And how it would not take a great deal to make it less so." She paused. "I know we cannot fix everyone's difficulty." "No," he said, "but you could bring soup." She looked at him. "Yes," she said, "I could." She brought soup twice more over the following month, and the oldest Cooper girl started coming over on Wednesday mornings to help in the garden and learn to cook, and Matilda paid her in vegetables and small amounts of baking supplies that she could take home. And by the end of August, the Cooper household was managing better, partly because Roy Cooper's leg had healed well enough for him to work again, and partly because the oldest Cooper girl had become competent enough to keep a kitchen running, while her mother managed everything else. John watched all of this with a quiet, growing feeling that he was married to someone remarkable and that he should probably make sure she knew he thought so. He told her on a hot August evening, sitting on the porch in the near dark with the cattle settled and the sky going from deep blue to black. He did not make a speech of it. He simply said, "I want you to know that I think you are remarkable." She turned to look at him in the dim light. She had a cup of tea cooling in her hands, something she made in the evenings from dried herbs from the garden. "Why?" she asked. "Because you feed this whole place," he said. "The men, the Coopers, the land. I do not think you always know you are doing it." She was quiet for a moment. "I know I am doing it," she said. "I just do not think about it as something separate from living. Taking care of people is not a separate activity. It is just living done right." He looked at her for a long moment. The night sounds of the Kansas grassland were around them, the insects, the distant cattle, the wind in the grass. He reached over and took her hand where it rested on the arm of the chair, and she looked down at their joined hands and then back up at the dark sky and did not pull away. They stayed on the porch until the stars were fully out, and then they went inside, and the house was warm and close and smelled of herbs and bread, and the particular comfortable smell of a place that was well lived in. And John Trask fell a little more in love with Matilda Hayes every single day, and he thought he would probably keep doing so for as long as he lived. Fall came to the Kansas grassland with its particular beauty, the grass going golden and then tawny, the sky clearing to an impossible blue that was colder every week, the mornings arriving with frost on the window glass and breath visible in the air. Matilda's garden came in fully in the last weeks of September, and the root cellar that had been nearly empty in May was now stocked in a way that made John stand and look at it with the distinct feeling of a man who has been shown what security actually looks like. She had put up 40 jars of tomatoes, 30 of green beans, 20 of apple preserves bought from an orchard north of town, dried herbs hanging from the kitchen ceiling in tied bunches, sacks of dried beans and corn, the cured pork from the pig, and a dozen other things arranged with a system that she explained to John in a tour that lasted 15 minutes and covered more information than he was able to fully retain, but whose general point, which was, "We will not go hungry this winter." came through perfectly clearly. "When I first came here," she said, standing in the middle of the root cellar with a lantern, "the only thing in here was a sack of flour that was half weevils and 3 jars of something I could not identify. I believe that was pickled beef," he said. "I believe it was regret," she said. He laughed. "You are probably right." In October, a problem came to them in the form of a man named Gideon Holt. Holt was a land speculator, a smooth-faced man from Topeka who had been buying up ranch properties in the area under somewhat coercive conditions, approaching ranchers who were in debt or having a bad year and offering low prices framed as favors, and if the ranchers declined, finding ways to make their situation more uncomfortable until they became more agreeable. 2 ranchers south of Caldwell had sold to him that summer. The word around town was that Holt had connections with a railroad company that was planning a spur line through the area and knew which land would be valuable before anyone else did. He arrived at the Double T on a Thursday afternoon in October, driving a fine buggy, wearing a town suit, and smiling in the manner of someone who has practiced smiling to look sincere. John was in the yard when he arrived. Matilda had seen the buggy from the kitchen window and came to stand in the doorway. Holt introduced himself, made compliments about the land and the operation, and within about 4 minutes made an offer to buy the Double T for a price that was below what John had paid for it in 1874. "I am not interested in selling," John said. "You might want to think about it before you decide," Holt said pleasantly. "The market for cattle has been unreliable. Drought years come. A man in your position might find. My husband said he is not interested," Matilda said from the doorway. Holt looked at her with the slightly condescending adjustment of a man who had not expected to be interrupted by a woman. "Mrs. Trask, a pleasure. I was just explaining to your husband. I heard what you were explaining," she said. "You were explaining that we should be afraid of things that might happen so that we will take less than what our land is worth today. We are not afraid and we are not selling. Good afternoon, Mr. Holt." There was a silence. John watched Holt's pleasant expression flicker and recalculate. "Mrs. Trask, Good afternoon," she said again, with the absolute finality of a door closing. Holt looked from Matilda to John. John held his gaze without expression. Holt nodded slowly, said something about not rushing a decision, climbed back into his buggy and drove off down the lane. When he was gone, John turned to look at Matilda in the doorway. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holt," he said. She came out of the doorway and dusted her hands together in a gesture of completion. "I have met his sort before," she said. "My father nearly sold his farm to a man like that in 1870. I was 19. I was the one who told my father not to." She looked after the direction the buggy had gone with a slightly narrowed expression. "They come back, they always come back." "And when he does?" John asked. "We will still not be selling," she said, and went back inside. Holt did come back twice. The first time John sent him off politely but firmly. The second time, in November, he came with a different approach, suggesting that he had heard the creek on the east pasture was running into some kind of disputed water rights situation with the neighboring claim, which was entirely false, and that he could help clear it up in exchange for a reasonable conversation about the property value. John had spoken with the county land office by then, because Pete Calloway's brother-in-law worked there, and had heard from a source of his own that Holt was using similar tactics on other properties. The water rights story was fabricated. The land records were clear. John told Holt this flatly and told him that if he came back with any more fabricated problems, he would be speaking to the county sheriff, and that Holt should know that the sheriff of Sumner County, a man named Graves, was not a man who found speculators charming. Holt did not come back a third time. "That is the end of that," Pete said, the morning after the last visit, when John told him what had happened. "I believe so," John said. "Mrs. Trask must have been pleased. She said she is gratified that he had enough sense to know when something was concluded." Pete shook his head, smiling. "She is something else, that woman." "Yes," John said, "she is." Winter settled over the ranch with its full weight in December, the temperature dropping hard, the wind coming down from the north with a cold intent that drove through any gap it could find. John and Pete had spent the fall preparing for it, extra wood cut and stacked, the cattle pens windbreak reinforced, the barn chinked and tight. Matilda had been preparing in her own way, and when the first real blizzard hit in mid-December and they were stuck indoors for 2 days, the root cellar and the kitchen between them meant that being stuck was not the ordeal it might have been. Matilda used the days indoors productively, which was not a surprise. She mended everything that needed mending in a systematic sweep of the house. She taught John a card game her mother had taught her, which he was bad at for 1 game and then suddenly good at, and she suspected him of having been bad on purpose until he won 4 games in a row, and the 5th game was genuinely competitive. She baked, because she baked the way some people breathe, as a natural response to being alive, and the house smelled remarkable. On the second evening of the blizzard, with the wind making the house creak and the stove working as hard as it could to keep the rooms warm, they sat at the kitchen table after supper with the cards between them and the lamp turned low to save oil. And Matilda said something that John had been waiting for her to say, but had not known when it would come. "I would like to write to my brother Thomas," she said. "I have not told my family much about the situation here. I left in a hurry and under some difficulty, as I think I mentioned." He remembered. She had mentioned in one of her letters before she came that her father had not been entirely pleased with the idea of her leaving, that he had relied on her running the house and that there had been a significant argument. She had not said much more than that. What kind of difficulty? He asked now, because now seemed like the right time to ask. She was quiet for a moment, turning a card over in her hands. "My father," she said, "is a man who loves his family and is also, in practical terms, someone who treated me as a resource rather than a person. I kept that house for 12 years. When I said I was leaving, he told me I was being selfish, that I was abandoning my responsibilities." She paused. "My brother Thomas did not agree with him. Thomas said I had a right to my own life. They argued about it. My father did not speak to Thomas for a month." She set the card down. "I wrote to Thomas before I left. I told him I was coming here and that I was all right, but I have not told him what this has been, what it is." She looked at John. "I would like him to know." "Write to him," John said immediately. "My father may not approve of Matilda," he said. "Write to your brother." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her face went soft in the way it rarely did, an unguarded moment. "All right," she said. "I will." She wrote the letter the next morning. It was long. He did not read it. That evening she read him certain parts of it, the parts that described the land and the house and the kitchen garden and the winter stores and Pete and Darnell. And she read him the part where she said, "I think I am living now, Thomas, in the way I should have been able to live years ago, and I am not sorry for any of it." And John listened to that sentence and felt it settle in his chest like something coming home. Thomas Hayes wrote back in February, a warm and funny letter that made Matilda laugh at the table, a full, genuine laugh that John stored carefully in his memory, because she did not always laugh that freely. Thomas said he was glad she had found her place, and that if he ever got himself to Kansas he would expect to be fed. And John, reading over Matilda's shoulder at her invitation, decided he liked Thomas Hayes very much. She wrote to her father as well, a shorter and more careful letter, and his reply, when it came in March, was stiff but not entirely unkind. It did not apologize and it did not ask for anything, but it acknowledged that she was well, and she seemed to feel that was sufficient for now, and John was wise enough to let her feel that way and not push it. Winter gave way to spring the way Kansas springs arrive, violently and suddenly, warmth cracking through the cold like something insistent, the grass going green almost overnight, the creek running high and fast with snowmelt, the cattle restless and moving. The second spring at the Double T was different from the first in ways that John was aware of every day. He had come into the first spring alone and into the second one not alone, and the difference was everything. Matilda started the garden earlier this year, having learned from last year what the soil needed. She expanded it as she had planned, the new section running along the south side of the house where the light was best. Darnell Webb had become her unofficial garden assistant in what was now clearly a standing arrangement, and she had taught him enough about growing things that he had started a small vegetable plot of his own at the place where he boarded in town, which Pete reported with great amusement. "That boy is going to be a farmer before you know it," Pete said. "He has good instincts," Matilda said, in the tone she used when she was pleased with someone but did not want to embarrass them. It was in April that John noticed something different about Matilda, not behavior exactly, more a quality of presence, something quieter and more interior than her usual self. She was not less competent or less engaged. She was precisely as organized and purposeful as ever. But there were mornings when she would pause at the kitchen window with her coffee and look out at nothing in particular for a moment. And there were evenings when she seemed to be carrying a thought she had not said yet. He asked her one evening, the kind of April evening when the sky goes on forever and the whole world smells like new grass, sitting on the porch in the wooden chairs that had now weathered to a comfortable gray. "You have been thinking about something for 2 weeks," he said. "I can wait longer if you need, but I want you to know I have noticed." She looked at him. Then she looked back at the sky. Then she said, "I think I am expecting." The word landed in the warm evening air and John sat very still for a moment. "Expecting," he repeated. "A child," she said with the tone of someone who is being patient with someone else's process. "Yes, he said. "Yes, I understood, He stopped. He turned to look at her fully. In the long evening light she looked as she always looked, steady and direct and real. But there was something in her eyes that he had not seen before, something that was uncertain in a way Matilda Hayes was almost never uncertain. "Are you all right?" "I am perfectly healthy," she said. "I have been considering the practical implications." "Is that all you have been considering?" She was quiet. "No," she said after a moment. "I have also been considering the less practical ones." And she looked at him and the uncertain thing in her eyes shifted. "I am glad," she said. "I am frightened because it is frightening, but I am glad." He reached over and took her hand the same way he had in August, and she let him. "So am I," he said, "frightened and glad." "Good," she said. "Then we are frightened and glad together, which is better than either alone." He held her hand in the April evening and watched the sky go dark over the Kansas grassland. And he thought that this was the thing he had not known he was looking for when he placed that advertisement in the matrimonial papers. Not just someone to cook, and not just someone to work beside, but this, the particular feeling of being frightened and glad together with someone who meets every moment of your life as though it is worth meeting. Ellie Calloway was informed and took charge of the practical preparations with a warmth and decisiveness that Matilda found deeply comforting. There was a midwife in Caldwell, a woman named Mrs. Ford, who had delivered more babies than she could remember, and Matilda went to see her in May and came back with information, instructions, and the satisfied expression of someone who has gathered necessary data. John spent the summer in a state of productive anxiety, which expressed itself mostly in building things. He built a proper cradle from oak, with his father's chisel set and more care than he had put into any project in years. He extended the front porch by 4 feet because Matilda had mentioned once that it would be pleasant to sit further out into the evening, and he took this mention and acted on it without being asked, which she noticed and told him was very thoughtful. He improved the water situation by digging the rain barrel location and building a proper runoff system from the roof, so there would be less hauling from the creek. Pete Calloway watched these projects with approval and sometimes assistance, and Darnell Webb helped with the porch extension and the cradle sanding and was, in general, so invested in the forthcoming event that Matilda finally told him he was going to be named an honorary uncle whether he liked it or not, and he went bright red and said he would like it very much, thank you. The baby came on the 15th of November, 1879, with Mrs. Ford in attendance and John pacing the length of the front porch until he wore a track in the boards, and Pete Calloway sitting in the kitchen drinking coffee and providing companionable company whether John wanted it or not. The labor was long but not complicated, and Mrs. Ford was calm and capable throughout. And when John finally heard the new sound coming from the bedroom, the particular insistent cry of a new person announcing their arrival, he stopped pacing and stood very still for a moment. Mrs. Ford came to the bedroom doorway. "Mr. Trask, you have a son." He went in. Matilda was propped against the pillows, tired in a profound physical way that he could see in every line of her face, but her eyes were bright and clear, and she was looking down at the bundle in her arms with an expression that he had never seen on her face before, and that made something in him feel very large and very quiet at the same time. The baby was red and small and furious about the world and unmistakably, extremely real. John sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son and then at his wife and found that he did not have words for any of it, which was all right because Matilda seemed to understand. "He is loud," she said. "Good," John said. "This is a loud country." She looked up at him and laughed, real and warm and exhausted, and he took her hand and held it and looked at the baby. And Pete Calloway could be heard from the kitchen making sounds consistent with a man who was very moved and was dealing with it by pouring more coffee. They named him William Thomas Trask, William for John's father and Thomas for Matilda's brother, who received a letter about his nephew's arrival and wrote back with the kind of joy that crossed 1,000 miles of paper. Her father wrote too, shorter, stiffer, but he wrote, and he said he was glad for healthy mother and child, and Matilda read that letter twice and set it on the shelf where she kept the ones she wanted to keep. William Trask was, from the very beginning, a child who had opinions about things, which surprised no one who had met either of his parents. He was a good baby in the sense that he was healthy and ate well and grew fast, but he had decided views on when he should sleep, and they did not always align with when his parents felt he should sleep. Matilda managed him with the same practical resourcefulness she brought to everything, and John proved himself a more involved father than either of them had known to expect, willing to walk the baby at any hour of the night without complaint, standing in the kitchen in the early morning dark bouncing William against his shoulder while the stove warmed. "You do not have to get up every time," Matilda told him, one night in December when he appeared in the doorway at 2 in the morning as she was feeding the baby. "I know," he said, and came in and sat with her and kept her company until William was done and settled, and she looked at him across the lamplight with an expression that was love made visible, warm and certain and settled, the kind of love that is not a feeling but a fact, the kind that grows out of knowing someone through seasons and difficulties and ordinary days and comes out the other side more solid than any other thing. "John," she said, "I was wrong about one thing when I first wrote to you." He looked at her. "What is that?" "I said I was not afraid of hard work," she said. "That was true, but I did not know then that hard work could also be this good." She looked down at the baby who had fallen asleep with the abrupt completeness of infants, a small warm weight in her arms. "I did not know it could be this." "Neither did I," he said. She looked up at him. "I am glad we are finding out together." "So am I," he said, "every single day." The winter passed and spring came again, the third spring at the Double T, and the ranch had changed in 3 years in ways that were visible in every direction. The garden was established and productive. The root cellar was organized and full at the start of every winter, and still contained good stores at the end of it. The house itself had been added to by a half-room off the back that served as a proper pantry, which John had built in the summer after William was born, because Matilda had been using a corner of the bedroom for overflow storage, and it was, in her words, not a long-term solution. The porch was wide and had 2 good chairs and a small bench. The firebox on the stove had a new gasket and drew perfectly. The curtains in the bedroom window were straight, both of them. Pete had confirmed this on multiple occasions. Darnell Webb had left in the spring to take up a homestead claim of his own, 20 miles north, and he had come to tell them with the slightly panicked excitement of someone embarking on something enormous. Matilda had packed him a box with seeds from the garden and a handwritten set of instructions, and 2 jars of preserved tomatoes and a loaf of bread. And Darnell had stood in the yard holding this box and looking like a man who was not going to cry and then cried a little anyway, and John shook his hand, and Matilda told him he was going to be fine and that she expected a letter every month to prove it. He wrote every month. The homestead was coming along. He had planted the seeds. He had met a young woman in the nearest town who had been the subject of his last 3 letters and whose name was Annie. Matilda wrote back and told him she expected to hear more about Annie and also whether the tomatoes had come up. In the autumn of 1880, when William was nearly a year old and pulling himself up on the furniture with the single-minded determination that suggested he was going to walk very soon and very fast, Matilda told John she was expecting again. "How do you feel?" He asked immediately from the lesson of the first time. "Glad again," she said, "still a little frightened, less than last time." "Good," he said, "same for me." This pregnancy was easier, or perhaps they were simply better at it. Mrs. Ford came out to the ranch for the birth in June of 1881, and the second child arrived with less drama and more efficiency, which Matilda said was a matter of knowing what to expect, and the baby said was a matter of being constitutionally in a hurry. The second baby was a girl, which William seemed to find interesting for about 4 minutes before losing interest in favor of a wooden spool he was rolling across the floor. They named her Eliza Jane, Eliza for no particular reason except that it suited her, and Jane for Ellie Calloway, who had been quietly invaluable throughout everything and who, when told the baby's middle name, said, "Oh, for heaven's sake," and then had to excuse herself to the porch for a few minutes. William adored his sister with the passionate and occasionally inconvenient enthusiasm of a toddler who has discovered something fascinating. He brought her things, pine cones, interesting pebbles, a piece of dried grass that had a good shape. Matilda watched this carefully and told John that William had a generous nature, which was a fine thing. John watched William attempt to give Eliza a bite of his cornbread when she was 6 weeks old, and concluded that William also had judgment issues, which were going to keep everyone on their toes. The ranch had taken on a new hand to replace Darnell, a quiet young Mexican man named Rodrigo Vega, who was an excellent horseman and had come up through the cattle trails from Texas. John hired him in the spring after speaking with him for 20 minutes and deciding he was competent and honest, which were the only qualifications he cared about. Pete Calloway approved. Matilda fed Rodrigo the same way she had fed Darnell, with the simple assumption that everyone who worked at the Double T was going to eat properly, and Rodrigo responded to this with the quiet and complete loyalty of a man who has been treated with more dignity than he expected. Life at the Double T had a fullness to it now that John had not known was possible when he had lived in that house alone, eating beans from a pot, staring at the stove that smoked when the wind came from the northwest, not knowing what he was missing. He had thought in those years that he was managing fine. He had thought surviving was living. Matilda had shown him, slowly and without making a production of it, that he had been wrong about that. Living was the bread smell in the morning. Living was the argument about the pig that he had been wrong about. Living was William walking for the first time across the kitchen floor, and Matilda catching him with a practice swoop and swinging him up, both of them laughing. Living was sitting on the wide porch in the long Kansas evenings watching the light change over the grassland, with Eliza asleep in the cradle he had built, and William sitting between them examining a beetle with deep scientific interest. Living was the root cellar full, and the garden coming in right, and the stove drawing perfectly, and Pete Calloway at the table with coffee on a winter morning, and Rodrigo with his quiet competence in the horse barn and letters from Darnell about Annie, who he had married in the fall of 1881, and the particular quality of Tuesday evenings when supper was done, and the children were settled, and the house was quiet in the specific way. It was quiet when it was full of sleeping people. And Matilda would sit at the kitchen table with a book, and John would be doing accounts, and neither of them would speak for an hour, and it was the best hour of his week. In the spring of 1882, Thomas Hayes came to Kansas. He arrived by train to Wichita and came to Caldwell on the stage, the same way his sister had come 4 years earlier, and John drove in to meet him. And when Thomas Hayes stepped off the stage, he was clearly Matilda's brother in the way that strangers who share a blood cannot hide, the same direct brown eyes, the same quality of taking everything in at once. He was 24, younger than Matilda by 3 years, with an easy laugh and good manners and a carpenter's hands. He spent 10 days at the Double T, and those 10 days were among the best John could remember, not only for Matilda, who was transformed by having her brother there, more openly joyful than she usually allowed herself to be, but for the whole household. Thomas was good with children and they with him, William immediately and completely won over, Eliza studying him with infant gravity for 2 days before apparently deciding he passed whatever test she was administering. Thomas helped with ranch work in the mornings with the unassuming competence of someone who had grown up doing physical work, and in the evenings, he and Matilda talked the way siblings talk who have been separated and have things to fill in, and John would sit nearby and listen and learn all the things about her life before Kansas that the letters had not contained. He learned that she had been the one, at 15, who had kept the household running after their mother died. He learned that she had read everything she could get hold of, because books were the only way she had of going somewhere when she could not go anywhere. He learned that her father, Edward Hayes, was not a cruel man but was a limited one, and that the damage he had done was not malicious but was real, and that Matilda had carried it for years before deciding to put it down and leave. "You are good for her," Thomas told John one afternoon when they were out at the east fence and Matilda was inside with the children. He said it simply, as a thing he had observed. "She is good for me," John said, "more than I can easily say." "She would not want you to be easy about it," Thomas said. "She would want you to say it anyway." "You know her well," John said. "I know her better than anyone except you," Thomas said. "Now." When Thomas left, Matilda walked to the gate of the lane and watched the wagon until it was out of sight, and John stood beside her. When she turned back toward the house, she had the look of someone who has had something good and is glad of it even though it is over, which is a different and better feeling than loss. "He liked you," she said. "I liked him," John said. "Genuinely." "Good," she said, and took his arm for the walk back to the house, which was something she did not always do and which he paid attention to. Her father wrote that fall, a longer letter than any he had written before. It was still not an apology exactly. Edward Hayes was not made of apology, but it was something closer to honesty than anything he had written before, an acknowledgment that she had been asked to carry more than was fair, and a thing that read, if you were willing to read it generously, like an old man arriving slowly at some recognition of what he owed. Matilda sat with that letter for a long time. John brought her coffee and left her alone with it. Later she came to find him in the barn where he was working on the tack, and she said, "I am going to write him back something kind." "I think that is right," John said. "It does not mean I am forgetting the years," she said. "No," he said. "It means you are bigger than them." She looked at him for a moment. "You know," she said, "you say the right thing more often than I expected, for a man who spent 4 years talking primarily to cattle." He laughed. She smiled and kissed him, briefly and with the ease of someone who has been kissing the same person for 4 years and finds it still worth doing, and went back to the house to write the letter. The Double T settled into its full and proper life over the years that followed, adding and growing in the way of good things that are tended. By 1884, the cattle herd had grown to nearly 500 head, and John had negotiated a profitable contract with a cattle buyer who came through Caldwell every fall, which meant the finances of the ranch were no longer merely sufficient, but actually comfortable. They were able to hire a second hand and invest in improvements to the barn, and replaced the aging wagon with a newer one. And Matilda bought herself a proper set of canning equipment and a set of kitchen knives that she cared for with the reverence of someone who understands the value of a good tool. The garden by 1884 was a substantial kitchen garden that fed the household and the hired men through the growing season and provided enough preserved stores to be generous with through the winter. Matilda had added a section of herbs that she grew partly for cooking and partly because she had learned, from Mrs. Ford and from her own reading, something about their practical uses, and she had become a person that neighbors came to when they needed advice about ailments, though she was careful always to recommend the doctor for anything serious. The Cooper family, Roy and Martha and their children, had recovered fully from the difficult stretch of 1878 and were prospering by 1884, and the oldest Cooper girl, whose name was Helen and who was now 18, had grown into a capable and serious young woman who came to Matilda for advice about a great many things, and whom Matilda spoke of with the particular warmth she reserved for people she felt were really something. William Trask was 4 years old and absolutely determined about everything. Eliza Trask was nearly 3 and somewhat more deliberate, but no less determined. They were the particular joy and exhaustion of parents who loved their children completely and could really use an afternoon off, a situation that Ellie Calloway solved by occasionally taking one or both children for the day, which she did with the easy generosity of a woman who genuinely enjoyed children and had the patience for it. In the autumn of 1884, Matilda told John she thought she might be expecting again. "How do you feel?" he asked, because he always asked. "Glad," she said. "Less frightened than either time before." "Good," he said. "3 children," she said with a measuring expression. "The house has room," he said. "I know it does." She looked at him. "You did not build that extra room last winter just for storage, did you?" He said nothing. "John Trask," she said with the expression that was not quite a smile but was very close to it. "I built it for storage," he said, "among other possible uses." She shook her head slowly, the not quite smile fully present now. "Among other possible uses," she repeated. "Yes, all right." The 3rd baby was born in the late spring of 1885. Another boy, healthy and loud, and clearly intending to be a force of nature. William received this new brother with slightly more composure than he had received Eliza, being older and knowing somewhat more of what to expect. And Eliza studied the new baby for several days with a scientist's careful attention before approving him. They named him Daniel Roy. Daniel for no particular one person, and Roy because Roy Cooper had, over the years since that first basket of bread and beans in 1878, become a genuine friend of the family, and his wife Martha had wept with genuine feeling when they told her what the baby's middle name was going to be. John Trask stood in his kitchen on a morning in June of 1885, watching his wife move around the room in the particular efficient way she had always moved, setting a pot of something on the stove, checking on something in the oven, simultaneously monitoring the whereabouts of William and Eliza through the window over the sink, while Daniel slept in the cradle that had now held 3 babies. The kitchen smelled of bread and something savory, and the morning light was coming through the straight curtains, both of them level, and outside the grassland was green and the cattle were out on the good pasture, and Pete Calloway was crossing the yard from the barn with the same easy walk he had had for 7 years. Matilda turned from the stove and found John standing in the doorway watching her. She raised her eyebrows. "What are you doing?" she said. "Looking," he said. "At what?" "Everything," he said. She gave him the look, the assessing, warm, slightly exasperated look that she had been giving him for 7 years, and that he would not trade for anything in the world. "You are going to be late to the east pasture," she said. "I know," he said. He crossed the kitchen and stood beside her at the stove, and she turned to look at him, and he put his hands on either side of her face and kissed her in the way he still kissed her after 7 years, like it was the right thing to do and he was glad to be doing it. And she kissed him back the same way, and then she said against his mouth, Pete is in the yard." "I know," he said, and let her go and picked up his hat from the hook, and she turned back to the stove. "Come back at noon," she said. "There will be soup." "I will come back at noon," he said. He went out into the June morning, and the door closed behind him, and the house behind it was full of bread smell and children, and his wife doing the 10,000 things she did every day that made it a life rather than a survival. And John Trask walked out to the good green pasture of the Double T under a wide Kansas sky and felt, as he had been feeling every day for 7 years with an intensity that never seemed to diminish but only deepened, that he was a man who had not known what living was until a woman with a cornbread recipe and more backbone than anyone he had ever met had stepped off a stage in the spring of 1878 and shown him. He had sent for a wife who could cook. She had arrived and shown him how little he had been living. And then every day after she had shown him what living was, and he had shown her in return, and the Double T spread out around them in the good Kansas morning, full and alive and real, and the children's voices came from inside the house, and somewhere in the east pasture a cow gave a low call to the morning, and Pete Calloway said, "Morning, Mr. Trask," as he always had, and John said, "Morning, Pete," as he always had. And the day was beginning again in the way of good days that do not end so much as circle back, each one carrying something from the one before, and he would not change a single piece of it. Not the beans from the pot he had eaten for 4 years before he knew better, not the crooked curtain on the bedroom window that had been the beginning of something, not the first letter that smelled faintly of lavender and contained a cornbread recipe with a note in the margin that said, "Do not rush the buttermilk. It matters." It all mattered. Every single bit of it had mattered. Because it had led here to this morning, to this life, to Matilda Hayes, who was Matilda Trask, who was his wife and his partner and his best friend and the best thing that had ever found him, or that he had ever been wise enough to look for. He went to see to his cattle. She went to see to the bread. And the Double T breathed in and breathed out in the June morning, full to its rafters with everything that a life well lived should hold, not a surviving thing, not a getting by thing, but a real and whole and deeply good thing, built from years of honest work and honest love, from arguments about pigs and letters from brothers and children with opinions, and a kitchen that always smelled like something worth coming home to. That was all of it. That was the whole thing. And it was enough, more than enough, it was everything.